if you look at the pharma companies, the medical device companies, the food companies, a lot of investment going on up there, a lot of capital investment. A lot of the major players across all the industries, we'll have a look in a second, they're all in Ireland. And they're all here because of education, because of corporation tax. There's lots of other reasons, but lots of good reasons they're here. And one of the challenges, and you might find it hard to imagine, is one of the biggest challenges out there at the moment is a lot of these companies are finding it very hard to find people. And you might have the skills, so there are opportunities out there. And that's the challenge you need to look at. So there are roles out there in different industries. What we're going to do is we'll have a quick look at some of these industries, and I'll talk about what roles are there. And primarily what I'm going to talk about is some of the skills that you have and how do you bring those to the industries. So let's talk a little bit about the industries for a few minutes. Again, if you look at pharma, well established in Ireland at this stage. Most, if not all, of the top players are here, and they're all here, and the plan is that they will stay here. You have somewhere in the region of 24,500 people working directly in the industry, with at least that again in support areas of the industry. If you look at pharma in Ireland, at least 120 pharma companies in Ireland, a lot of them big companies. Couple of main clusters, Dublin, Cork would be the main clusters, some in the west as well, some in Limerick, with the likes of Regeneron obviously moving into Limerick as well. So a large amount, particularly in Leinster and particularly in the Munster area. Again, if you look at the big pharma companies in the world, pretty much all of them are here. One of the reasons why they're here, as a country, we're highly regulated, but for the most part we adhere to regulations, particularly within the pharmaceutical industry. If you think of the products that are manufactured, the HPRA, for example, which would be the regulatory authority in Ireland, would be highly recognised. And the industry is a very, very well controlled and regulated industry. For the most part, people do the right things. So that's one of the reasons why people set up here. If you look at the medical device or the medtech industry, again, very, very strong here. 8 out of 10, 15 out of 20, whatever number you want to put on it, of the big medical device companies are here. A lot of the big companies, medical device as well as is an organisation where a lot of small companies start off here. Outbreaks from colleges, people come up with a good idea for a medical device, and they start to develop, and they're very good companies to get into because they're just starting off and they're looking for people with skills, they're looking for people with ideas. Again, it's about making yourself known to these companies. 250 plus companies out there, 7.2 billion in terms of exports, etc. Again, somewhere in the region of 25,000 people working in that industry. Very, very strong industry, very, very compliant industry. If you look at food, food has expanded quite a bit in the last few years. Again, somewhere in the region of 50,000 people working directly in the industry. 10 billion in terms of exports, 1.7 billion in terms of payroll. So very, very strong industries out there. And if you look at the companies, again, a lot of the major players in the food industry are in Ireland and they're here to stay. Again, over the years, we've managed to place people quite successfully in a lot of those food companies. Again, all of these companies are really looking for people these days. Sometimes when you ask in terms of salaries, and this is some data I pulled off last night from Sigmar Recruitment, when you look at the salaries that are out there for the different industries and the different sectors in terms of roles. So for example, if you look at production roles, typically somebody at an operator level, somebody with 1 to 2 years experience are just pretty much starting out. Somewhere around 30k would be fairly standard in terms of starting. It'll obviously fluctuate up and down. But you could see there that 3 to 5 years experience, 35k, 40k plus for 5 years experience. Obviously when you take into account shift, that can vary up and down as well. There's obviously a bit of a difference between working in Dublin and kind of the rest of the country. But obviously the cost of living is more expensive here as well. Again, you can see there are people who have production managers, directors roles. There's a fairly reasonable salary there. Things like clinical research, for example, again, a lot of companies in Ireland looking for people in the areas of clinical research in terms of salary. So data coordination, anybody with data expertise, there are opportunities there. People involved in running clinical trials or clinical trials management. Again, so reasonably representative what's out there. A lot of these science-based roles are looking for people to work in labs. So QA, QC, for example. And if you look at some of the salaries there, microbiologists, big demand for microbiologists analysts out there, QA analysts, QC analysts, supervisors, managers. Again, plenty of opportunities out there in all of those areas, food science, pharma. If you work at one, you can kind of transition into the other fairly easily. Excuse me. Regulatory compliance, again, big demand for people with experience in regulatory compliance. So excuse me, anybody who's experienced in working with the likes of the HPRA or any regulatory authority. We come across a lot of people who are even coming with medical backgrounds, you know, doctors, surgeons, dentists, for example, who want to transfer into the industry because they've worked in that regulated environment. Again, those skills are very, very relevant. And if you look at R&D roles, again, there are some R&D roles in the country in food science, in pharma, in medical device. Again, there's a range of salaries there that you can see that would be available, right from somebody who has a PhD in chemistry, right up to R&D managerial roles, etc. as well. All of these industries are highly regulated. And what we mean by that is that, you know, everything that's done in these industries is documented, everything is verified. And when you think of the industries themselves, that's the way you want it to be. If you're taking a drug, if you're taking a medication, you want to be absolutely sure that what you're taking is correct, that it's done correctly. So a lot of verification, a lot of validation is actually done. When things do go wrong, which they do, deviations need to be investigated, root causes need to be understood as well. So anything that's done is done in a controlled environment. That's not to say that you don't have the opportunity to be innovative, but it is very much a controlled environment, and that's important. So that's kind of a bit of the context in terms of the industry, but it's useful even to think about at this stage, where are the roles out there? Because sometimes people have this perception that, you know, you have to wear a white coat to work in the pharmaceutical industry. You know, you have to come with a degree in chemistry or biology or something like that. That's not necessarily the case at all. And when you think of the career, whatever career you're going to choose, ideally you think of a career that, you know, if you could tick these three boxes, you'd be doing very, very well. Is there a job out there that I love doing? You know, do I like science-based activity? Do I like, you know, sales? Do I like engineering, for example? Is there something out there that I'm really good at? And obviously, what's really important is, does it pay well? Okay, so it's great to find a job that you love doing and you're good at it, but if it doesn't pay well, then that's not really all that useful in the long term. So these three things are important, and you'll probably oscillate between different levels of these as you go through your career. But the other thing when you look at what's actually happening out there as well is there's an awful lot more change going on in the industry. You know, originally when I started out as an engineer, electronic engineer, and I did engineering stuff. So I did kind of maths, and I did physics, and I did science, and I did engineering type stuff. And I didn't do any HR stuff. I didn't talk about teams, and I didn't do any coaching stuff. But these days that's fundamentally flawed, because there's a huge overlap between different skills that you need and also different industries that you could work in. So one of the things that I want to talk about here is there are other skills out there that you may have that are very, very important, but there's other skills out there that you need to develop and make sure they're on your CV as well. Because your ability to get into a job is more about your competencies rather than what job you did previously. You want to be defined by your competencies rather than the jobs that you did. So if you look at what's happening, you know, in the world, an awful lot more things are connected. You know, social media, smart machines, smart technologies, big data all over the place. We have a need for this idea to be able to adapt to all of these things. This is important to be able to do that. And pure academic knowledge isn't enough anymore. There was a time where we went to college and we got educated, and then we got a job, and then we stopped being educated. And then we worked in the job, and then all of a sudden maybe we didn't have a job, and we went back into education again. That doesn't work anymore. So we'll always be in a situation in the future where we'll always be educating ourselves. Sometimes formally and sometimes informally, but that's fundamentally important. And if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, you know, even a very high level, I'm sure you've heard the high level stuff, you know, all these products going off patent, you know, so the big blockbuster drugs, the Lipitors, the Viagras, all these types of products. You know, very, very few of them out there, but if a company is dependent on that, then there's a big cliff that they might fall off. More focus on things like personalized medicine. You know, in future, you'll have the ability to 3D print a tablet because of a particular disease that was diagnosed by a device that's probably implanted in you, or something that you're communicating back in. Right? So that technology will be fundamentally different. More complex drugs are happening, more continuous manufacturing. So rather than making big batches of drugs, you make smaller quantities. More outsourcing, a lot of more things like that happening in the industry. Big data everywhere you go. We're surrounded by data these days. And traditionally what has happened is sometimes people go into a job, and you do engineering, for example. Therefore, your first job almost dictates what your second job is going to be. So, for example, you decide to do, chemical engineering, you go into a chemical engineering company, then by definition, your next job is in chemical engineering, and your next job is in chemical engineering. So you tend to pigeonhole yourself into those roles, and you tend to say, I'm a chemical engineer. But if there's no job in chemical engineering, then what you do? So what's becoming more the norm these days is you start out in one industry. So in my own case, I started out in engineering, and I worked in the electronics industry, and I moved from there into a technical training role in the semiconductor company, and I moved there into a process improvement role in the pharmaceutical industry, and I moved there into creating my own business in the areas of business improvement, and then work these days across multiple industries, doing lots of different things. So what's really important is the ability to be able to move and the ability to develop your skills. And traditional science-based stuff talks about these types of things, science and manufacturing and regulations and documentation and calibration, all this kind of stuff. So when you go to college, you tend to do these things. So whether it's environmental skills, software development, etc. So you tend to do those things. But what I would argue these days is there are other skills that we all need. It doesn't matter where you work. And one of those skills I would suggest is this whole idea of, how do you make sense of stuff? And that's a very broad statement to make, but think of the amount of data we're being thrown at us these days. Even things like we have so much reliance on calculators, on computers to do things. Sometimes your kids you might say to your kids, what's 3 and 3? And they put it into a calculator and the answer comes back and it's 60. And they say, well, look, the calculator said it's 60, it must be 60. So this ability to look at something and make sense of it says, that's not right, that doesn't make sense. That skill is really, really important. How do you look at all the data that's out there and make sense of it? If you look at the amount of data that's presented in social media and everywhere these days, it's the ability to make sense of that is a skill that is actually becoming lost. It's a hugely important skill. How do you look at something and you can discriminate it? How do you filter out the stuff that's irrelevant? Take out the information that's really, really important. So that ability to make sense of what's going on in our world, it seems like a very obvious thing, but it's a skill that is hugely important, to look at something and make sense out of it. Also, what I find these days is the ability to work with different people across different nationalities, different cultures, different time zones, different work ethics. These things are fundamentally important. Some of the programs we have, we assess people through group assignments. And one of the most important skills we're trying to give people is the ability to work with people. Sometimes people say, well, I'd love a job where I work on my own and I don't have to interact with anybody else. Those jobs don't exist. So if you can't work with other people, it doesn't matter how good technically you are, academically you are, if you can't interact with people, if you can't go into something to make it successful, it's not going to work for you. So that ability to be able to do that. How do you engage? How do you work in a virtual environment? How do you work across, like I said, different cultures, different nationalities? All these things are extremely important as well. And how do you go into it with the intention of getting things done? There's more than enough people out there who can convince you to say, we can't do this because of all these reasons. You really want to work with somebody who will come up with all the reasons what we need to do to make it successful is more important. The other ones are, other skills about the ability to make sense and think about things, the ability to come up with solutions, to be able to solve problems, for example, hugely important as well. Traditionally we may have learned this is how you solve a problem, but more and more these days, the problems we're looking at, the solution doesn't reside in that industry, it resides somewhere else. So it's that ability to find the solution somewhere else. So things like Six Sigma, if you're familiar with that, things like problem solving, things like trees, for example, which is an innovative tool that the likes of Dyson use to come up with all their solutions. Using those concepts in different industries are extremely important as well, and that you can apply it to any industry. It doesn't really matter what it is. So if you look at some of the skills that are out there these days that are really, really important, The ones we talked about over on the left-hand side and the middle, they're important. But this idea of making sense of things, this idea of social intelligence, do you understand what's going on around you? You can make sense of it, and you can recognize it as rubbish if it is rubbish. How do you work in terms of different cultures, different competencies? All of these things are really, really important as well. So what we do as an organisation is we try and focus on a lot of these additional skills to provide to people when they go for roles. And this is kind of a roadmap, I suppose, in terms of what we provide to different organisations. And let's say, for example, you start off up here with, maybe you don't have a formal third level of qualification. Getting a formal third level of qualification these days is very important. So one option you can have is anybody who has a leaving cert in trade, you can look at level 6 courses. So level 6 course would be the equivalent of a certificate, anywhere between 6 months to a year. And we would offer courses in the areas of pharmaceutical, medical device, food industries. If you have a level 6 course, you could progress on to a level 7. Some people would refer to it as a diploma. It's also referred to as an ordinary degree these days. So you can progress into developing those skills in pharma, medical device, for example. Once you do that, you can progress into a level 8, which is the equivalent of an honours degree, or a portion of an honours degree. And again, we would offer courses in pharma, medical device, food, and for anybody who'd like to develop further, there are masters out there as well in all of those areas. And we're in the process of developing a whole suite of new masters as well to make it available for people in the future. So if you look at it, like I said, at level 6, everything from pharma, medical device, level 8, again in those areas, level 9 master's programs as well. All of these courses we develop in conjunction with ITT, one of our partners. One of our other partners is Griffith College in Dublin, and we develop courses in the areas of pharmaceutical business, for example, and in the areas of pharmaceutical analytics and technologies. So, in summary, I suppose what I wanted to say is that there are lots of roles out there within science-based industries. You won't necessarily find all of them through recruitment agencies. A lot of them is really where you have to contact people directly. Your network is fundamentally important. And I know people say, I hear you, but it's fundamentally important. You're far more likely to get a job through your network. 50, 60, 70% of the jobs that are out there come through the network, anybody's network. They're really, really important to do that. And there are skills, and what's really important is if you have worked in other industries, how do you position your competencies in your CV rather than necessarily, I'm a qualified plumber. Look at the competencies that you developed. Make sure those things are very prominent in your profile and your competencies, etc. as well. Okay. Huge overlap between the industries these days. I worked in Intel for a good few years. I worked in Wyeth or Pfizer for a good few years. They're the same thing. Pretty much the same as an organization. The product is different, but how people interact are fundamentally the same. So that's important. And there's always the demand to continue what we do. That's not going to change. You'll have to develop yourself in different industries, different areas, and you have to have this ability to move. And your career will change. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's the right thing to do. Okay. So we're just outside. If we want to come and talk to us at any stage, please do. We do offer courses in any of those areas, and hopefully that was of use, and hopefully it'll give you a bit of an insight into the industries. They are good industries to work in, and thank you for your time. If you have any questions, maybe what we'll do is we could take them outside, we can have a chat outside, because there's another speaker at one. Thanks, folks.